along the east of Maine is a Canadian province known as New Brunswick. New Brunswick is rich with Indigenous and Acadian history and all things that anyone listening to a true crime doesn't really care about. But I have never been there. It is on my bucket list to go because it just looks really lovely, and I've heard amazing things about the people and the sights that you can see there. And New Brunswick is on the east coast of Canada, but it's not actually our easternmost province. That would be Newfoundland and Labrador. Newfoundland and Labrador, their coast is along the Labrador Sea, which becomes the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, there's some other geography in there. There's basins and seas and bays and whatnot, but it becomes the Atlantic Ocean, and that is the big body of water that you'd be looking at if you're trying to picture where things are. New Brunswick actually borders the Southwest Basin that leads into the Atlantic Ocean. And this Southwest Basin has within it the Gulf of St. Lawrence. I think bodies of water are very confusing, and I really wasn't paying attention that day in school, but bodies of water also tend to be connected, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence connects to the Miramichi Bay. And then that started me kind of rabbit holing and then trying to figure out which direction the water was actually flowing in. And then I inadvertently involved my husband in the conversation, and suddenly we're talking about the Antarctic. But the bottom line is the Miramichi Bay has this river that cuts through a large portion of New Brunswick that creates the Miramichi River. And then that branches off into the northwest and southwest branches of the Miramichi, and then either peters out or that's where the whole thing starts. I'm not really sure. But the Miramichi River does divide the city of Miramichi, which used to be a few separate smaller cities of there was Chatham, Nelson, and Newcastle, but then in 1995, everything was all kind of annexed into Miramichi City. And then when today's story begins, it was still separate townships. And on Sunday, March 24th, 1974, the body of 54-year-old Mary Beatrice Redmond was found outside the front door of her apartment at 88 Bridge Road in Chatham, which is on the south side of the Miramichi River. And on the second floor landing that led up to her apartment door, she was found. She had been married to Ryan Redmond, and she was also had her 85-year-old mom living with them, who her mom was very dependent on her for her care. Mary was described as a very quiet woman. She attended Mass on Saturday evenings, and early that Saturday morning, she had been found. She was face down on the landing of the stairs. She had a number of cuts on her face. She had been stabbed between 56 and 80 times. Her purse was missing, as was her coat and her hat, and then clutched in her right hand was her gold wristwatch. Now, it is believed that she was confronted when she was walking home from church on the Saturday evening and then possibly chased up the stairs to her apartment. Robbery was the suspected motive, and at the time, there was a rather intensive investigation into her murder, but the case eventually went cold. And spoiler alert, is actually still unsolved to this day. However, there is this one guy that was questioned as a really strong suspect in the case. Rumors around town was that this guy did a lot of kind of rotten things and always seemed to stay kind of a step ahead of the police. And that was 25-year-old Allan Legere. Allan had been born in Chatham Head, which is a neighborhood in Chatham, which is now part of Miramichi City. He had been born on February 13th, 1948. He was the youngest in his family. He had two sisters and a brother. He never did know his father. His mom, Louise, had taken in boarders to provide for their family. And when Alan was 9 years old, his brother was killed in a pedestrian accident. Him and a couple of friends were out walking and they were hit by a car, and both him and one of his friends passed away. And he was 9 at the time, and he just never really got over that. He never really recovered from the loss emotionally. And the family grew up very poor. Alan was a bit of a show off, but he was actually a good machinist and was able to fix up old cars really well. So he had a bit of a reputation for being good at what he was doing. He did drop out of school before finishing, and he had a reputation as well for getting into a lot of fights. He did start having some stints, like short stints, in and out of prison for things like assault, theft, property crimes, but also being a peeping Tom, which I guess started when he was about 16 or 17. When he was 18, he moved to North Bay, Ontario, and he actually got married and had 2 kids, with a woman living there, but he was, of course, abusive towards her and the kids as well. So her and the kids left him, and then he moved back to Miramichi in the 1970s, and he started working at a lumber mill there, but he got fired for possessing some stolen property. He felt the job was beneath him anyways, and he just kinda did a few odd jobs. He got fired a lot for fighting with coworkers or stealing something, or he would sometimes get fired because he got arrested and went to prison for a short time. But he always returned to the Miramichi when his sentence was done or whenever he was out on parole. And he eventually remarried a woman named Donna who was living in Moncton. He also beat her up quite a bit as well. And so while he was serving a sentence for theft and assault, Donna actually wrote to the parole board and asked them, please don't grant him parole. And if you do, she needed some advance notice because she was absolutely terrified of him. Well, they paroled him anyways, did not, of course, give her any notice. So when she found out about it, she immediately left, like she packed up and left Moncton and left to an undisclosed location. Mary Redmond was actually not the only time that Alan's name had come up in a murder investigation. In 1979, Nicholas DeGuay had been bludgeoned 67 times with an axe. And eventually, a young man, he was a teenager at the time, it was named Robbie Cunningham. He had been convicted of that, but for manslaughter because he was extremely high on LSD at the time. But Robbie had told the police during the investigation that Alan had been the one that had set him up for it, but he was never convicted of anything for that. No one has ever been convicted in Mary's murder, and by 1986, Allan Legere was 38 years old. He was living again in the Miramichi, selling used cars on a kind of a part-time basis and collecting welfare. And then directly east, about a 10-minute drive from Chatham, is this little town called Black River Bridge. And it's a town where John Glendinning and his wife Mary had both been born and raised. They had raised their own 2 daughters there, Margaret and Jeannie, and they were members of the Presbyterian Church, volunteers in the community hall. They made their living as the owners of the sort of the town gas station and general store that was on Highway 117. And they built their house right next to the store. And on the evening of June 21st, 1986, 66-year-old John and 62-year-old Mary, they cleaned up and then they closed up the shop and walked next door to their house for the night. And while they were getting ready for bed, the power went out on them. And a short time later, 3 men burst through the front door. One of them was wearing a nylon stocking over his head to kind of hide his identity. 2 of them were described as young, probably in their early 20s, and then the other one was a bit older, mid to late 30s, with scruffy hair and a beard. And the 3 men proceeded to start beating John about the head with a rock that they had gotten from the front garden and tied his hands and feet up. They also kicked him in the face. Now, Mary was pushed into the kitchen. She was tied to a chair, but she managed to get free because they had kind of sloppily done these knots. And she ran towards John to try and help him because they were continuing to beat him. And they pushed her into a closet where one of the men, one of the younger men, sexually assaulted her. And then afterward, they demanded to know where they kept the safe, which John had actually recently moved from the back room of the store into their upstairs bedroom in the house that they lived in. So Mary took the men upstairs, but then each time that she would try to like reach for the knob to try to help them open the safe, they would punch her in the back of the head until she finally was knocked unconscious. And when she came to, she found that she was actually in the bathroom and she managed to call the police. And when they arrived, they found that she had a scarf that had been tied quite tight, like almost like a noose around her neck. 4 of her ribs were broken. She had a broken nose, a concussion, slashes and bruises pretty much everywhere all over her body. And in addition to the lifelong trauma of being sexually assaulted that she'd had to contend with, she was also left with a permanent droop to one of her eyelids. Now, John, beyond the horrific beating with a rock and several kicks to his head and face, he had been strangled with a t shirt, and that had been his cause of death. He was found in the upstairs bedroom face down in a pool of blood. There was a bloody shoe print on his face and a rock about the size of a grapefruit laying near his body. His face had been broken in several places, including his nose, his jaw, his cheekbones, like pretty much his whole face. So obviously, robbery was the suspected motive, in because the safe was gone, and that safe weighed about 350 pounds. So there's no way that this was just a one man job. They believed that there was more than one person involved. And it was discovered that the men that had broken in had originally cut the fuse box to the power to the shop, but didn't realize that it was also connected to the same fuse line that the house used, which is why the power in the Glendinning's house had gone out for them. They had smashed the lock, gained entry to the shop, but then discovered that the safe had been moved to the Glendinning house rather than the back of the shop where it had actually been kept for a number of years. On the 24th of June, there was an anonymous phone call that came into police from a woman. Now, she said what she had to say very quickly and then hung up before the call could be traced. She said that Allan Legere had come by her place early in the morning on the 22nd and tossed a roll of mostly $100 bills on her bed, like just in front of her, and said that they now had it made and that the money was about $14,000. It was all stained with this kind of reddish brown stuff that looked a lot like blood. And Alan had told her, now this was later believed to be his then girlfriend, Christine, that he had gotten the money because he had told Todd Matchett and Scott Curtis, who were a couple of local young men, where they could find the money. And she had said that Alan, Todd, and Scott had all fled Miramichi to go to St. John's in Todd's mom's car. It was a red car, and then it would later be discovered that they had repainted it black. So Christine was later put into witness protection, which leads most people to believe that she was the one that had made the phone call. Allan Legere had been a friend of Todd Matchett's dad, Bill, because Todd himself was only 18 and Scott was 19, but they both already had some somewhat lengthy criminal records for a lot of mostly misdemeanors, but some theft as well. So police paid a visit to Alan's mom, Louise, and she told him that she had seen Alan with two young men and that they probably didn't mean to do it. And I'm assuming she is referring to the murder part. But she did kind of disclose the location of where they could find the safe, which they did find in the woods that surrounded Chatham, which is actually Miramichi and around the rivers in those towns. There's a lot of like wooded areas around there. And so they found the safe in these woods. It had been overturned. The bottom had been ripped out. And of course, it was empty. There was no money in it. And so Canada wide warrants were issued for all three of the men. Both Todd and Scott were found hiding out in a Toronto hotel. They were kind of considering their options of maybe trying to cross over into the US. And now, while they were sitting in their holding cell, they were blabbing on with each other about all kinds of things about the 21st, the night of the 21st, including Alan's involvement in everything that had happened and that he had been the aggressor and the actual killer of John, and how the plan had only been to do a robbery and no one was actually supposed to die. Although I guess the deciding to sexually assault Mary had also not been a part of the original plan, but for some reason they had no issue with that part. But they also talked between each other that Alan was probably heading back to the Moncton area. And of course, all of their conversations were recorded. So Alan was stopped driving along the King George Highway near Newcastle, probably in a stolen vehicle, but it doesn't say that anywhere. And all three of the men were charged with second degree murder, which, of course, all come with an automatic life sentence if you're convicted. Because when a death occurs during the commission of a crime, that you are in any way, shape, or form involved with, you are just as culpable of murder as the one that actually does the killing. So even if you're just driving the getaway car, so don't do stupid things with your friends. I mean, stick to brunch and like sales racks at Marshalls or something where murder isn't likely to happen. All three of them were held in the Dorchester Penitentiary awaiting their trial. And on November 7th, Scott Curtis came up behind Allen, who was playing cards with three other inmates, and stabbed him in the back with a sharpened bread knife. His lung was actually punctured, so he was rushed to the hospital in Moncton. Now, he survived, unfortunately, leading to a whole bunch of nonsense and horror that comes later. Scott Curtis was never actually charged with that because Allen knew enough not to rat him out and would never identify who had attacked him, even though everybody knew who it was. So the trials for all three of them began in January of 1987. They were all tried together. They all initially pled not guilty to murder, of course, everybody blaming each other. Allen blamed Scott, Scott blamed Allen, Todd blamed Allen. But during about the second day of the trial, Scott and Todd decided to change their pleas to guilty to second-degree murder. So they got life sentences with a parole eligibility after 16 years. So they have both been out since about 2002. Now, a man testified at Allen's trial that the whole thing had to have been Allen's idea because about 2 weeks before the murder, he and this other guy had actually been recruited by Allen to basically do the same thing, not necessarily the murder, but the robbery. But they had not been able to go through with it because there had been a light on in the house and they just thought it was too risky. And because of them chickening out about it, Alan had actually threatened him. And there was also at the trial, there was a hair sample that was matched to Alan. There was one found on John's body and one found, I believe it was on Mary's clothing somewhere. Now, he testified in his own behalf, of course, because smart guys always do that. And he basically said that he had made this comment to this certain person, which he wasn't going to name, and that was probably him that did it, and that he had taken $14,000 from these guys for basically telling them where he thought the money was, which was in this safe that he believed was in the back of the room of the store because he had actually staked out the Glendinning store for a number of weeks beforehand. And after 4.5 hours of deliberation, he, of course, was convicted. So he got the life sentence and then he was eligible for parole after 18 years. And about an hour and a half later, after he had been sentenced to that, he somehow managed to, at some point, fashion this plastic fork into kind of a key and used it to get out of his shackles and tried to run, but he was tackled to the ground. So he was sent to the Atlantic Institution, which is a max security institution. He filed a bunch of appeals like they normally do, but they were all getting rejected. And by May of 1989, pretty much all of his appeals were done. He did have one last appeal that was waiting to be heard through the Supreme Court of Canada, but he didn't really think it was ever going to happen. He was being held in segregation because well, he squealed on people and he was known to be fighting a lot. And he said at that time, quote, half the jury knew my criminal reputation for years and he didn't get a fair trial. You may ask, am I Lily White? Of course not. I've been crooked for years, but no violence, end quote. Now, I wrote that quote down from the Times transcript, which is a Moncton paper from sometime around 1987, but darn if I can't find that article anymore. So I have no idea under what context he did, but I do know that at some point he had written a letter himself to a newspaper, but I wrote it down with quotes around it, so I'm pretty reasonably sure he actually said that to somebody. Anyways, so his appeals are all pretty much done. He's given up on the idea that the Supreme Court of Canada is going to hear him. So he he needed to be seen by a specialist, an ear specialist. Now, what they didn't know is that the reason he had to be seen by this ear specialist because of these recurrent ear infections he was having is because he had started to actually poke these random objects into his ear in order to induce these infections. So he had an appointment with this specialist in Moncton on May 3rd of 1989 at the Moncton Hospital. Now, the appointment itself was actually supposed to be at the doctor's office on the 15th, but it had gotten moved up and then would be at the hospital. Now, he had behaved himself actually in prison up until then for the most part. So they weren't really guarded around him, and so they didn't bother telling the hospital ahead of time that this life convict was coming in that day. So at 7:40 in the morning, there was 2 guards that came to his cell, but he needed a few minutes to go and use the washroom. And apparently what he actually did is that he used that break to put the TV antenna from his TV that was in his cell up his bum. Now, he was allowed to leave the prison with a newspaper and these 2 cigars that he had wrapped in plastic, even though he didn't smoke. He had on leg irons, a body belt, and handcuffs, and nobody noticed when he got out of the car to get into the hospital that one of the cigars that he had was cut in half and was now laying on the floor of the car. So they take him in and they're doing the paperwork to get him all ready, and he said, "I have to go to the bathroom again." So one of the guards took him to a staff washroom, and because it was a washroom that was sort of on the interior walls of the hospital, there was no window. So they let him go in and use the washroom. And the guard stood outside. And a couple of minutes later, he peeks his head out and he says, "Can you get me some toilet paper?" So the guard turns his back to go and find him some toilet paper. And he then runs out of the bathroom. He no longer has any leg irons or anything on, no handcuffs, nothing. And he's yelling, "Don't come after me." And he's now being chased by the one guard who was supposed to be guarding him at the bathroom. He ran out of the hospital. He runs past the driver of the car. One of them tried to mace him, but of course, he's running away, so all they're basically doing is just spraying mace into the air. And meanwhile, the other guard, the 3rd guard, is still doing paperwork. He has no idea that anything has just happened. Now, Peggy Olive was in the parking lot of the hospital at the time, and she was just handing over money to the parking attendant when Alan comes up to her window, tells her to move over because there's something under the card. She was smart enough to say no, but he pushed her over and tells her, "I'm doing 18 years for murder." He gets in the car and starts driving. He crashes through the gate and he keeps driving in this like zigzag pattern, heading westward through a number went made it through a number of stops. He was pausing at stop signs and he kept saying to her, quote, "He didn't do it. He didn't kill anybody. He wanted me to help him contact Linda Boyce or somebody, a reporter," he said, "that knew all about him and knew his file. He was also extremely bothered about my cat cage. It was really strange. It was in the front seat and in his way, and I helped trying to push it into the back seat. He kept looking at it. Finally, I moved it over, and there we were, me and him in the cat cage." End quote. Now, fortunately, he dropped her off about 10 minutes later. Of course, she ran into a store and called the police. And her car was actually found later in a parking lot on the west side of Moncton. Some of his clothes and belongings had actually been found in this residential area, but the residential area was near a railway with like lots of rail cars. So they assumed that he had been able to get away through one of these box cars. There were tons of sightings of him all over the place, like pretty much all over the country after that, because of course he was considered a dangerous offender. On May 7th, 62-year-old Max Ramsey was attacked in his house in Nova Scotia. The police were skeptical that it could have been Allan, but Max's wallet was found floating near this bridge near Newcastle, and his car was actually found in the river under the bridge. So it could have been him. There was a woman named Mary living in Chatham Head, and on May 10th, she was watching a hockey game until about 2 o'clock in the morning, and she came upstairs to go to bed, and this man's head popped up in her open window. Now, she knew it was Alan right away because she had actually once been a neighbor of his, so she recognized him. She called the police, but of course, by the time that they got there, he had disappeared, along with her rings that she had put on her dresser just by her window. And then there was the house of Annie Flam. She was 75 years old and she owned the corner store in Chatham since about 1939. So she's a long-time resident and she lived like up in an apartment above the store with her brother's wife, Nina. Her brother Bernie had actually died in 1973, but um, Annie had been a very motherly type. So she had taken in her sister in law, Nina, and on May 28th, 1989, Nina went to bed about 10 p.m. and Annie closed up the shop sometime after that. Nina was awoken in the middle of the night by a man demanding to know where Annie kept all her money. Now, Nina didn't know, so he beat her up and then sexually assaulted her and said that he was going to burn down the house with her in it. And he actually went into her closet, opened it, and started the closet on fire. But he had actually already started fires in four other places in the house and the store. Now, Nina managed to make it out alive. She was very badly injured, though, from the beating, but Annie did not. And then on June 1st, sometime after about 11 p.m., a man named Joe Ivory, who was a neighbor of Annie's, found a pair of glasses in his driveway, like just by his garage. He had caught a man in his headlights, trying to get break into his garage, and then when the headlights went on him, the guy took off. The glasses matched the prescription and the type that Allan wore. And then on October 1st of 1989, so a few months later, and people started to relax a bit, thinking, well, he'd left the area. I mean, he was still on the loose, but he had at least left the Miramichi area. Then on October 1st of 1989, 70-year-old Morrissey Doran, he was attacked in his home and asked for money. Now he fought back and was shot in the back, but fortunately he survived as well. And the next day, a very similar kind of break-in happened just down the road from where he lived. At the house of 76-year-old Edwin Russell and his wife, 63-year-old Evangeline. Fortunately, both of them survived as well. And then on October 13th of 1989, 45-year-old Donna, who lived with her 41-year-old sister Linda, last name Donnie, they were together living in Newcastle in the house that they had actually grown up in. They knew that Alan was on the run. They were trying to be careful, but that evening, Linda left to go and have coffee with a friend. It was just a walking distance away, like maybe a couple of blocks. And then she walked home around 11 p.m. She almost made it to the back door when Alan attacked her, broke her glasses. There was blood found on the driveway. He then went through the screen door and attacked Donna. Now, she tried to break free of him and run up the stairs, but he grabbed her by the hair and slammed her head against the wall. She was still alive after that, but he slashed at her chest and her face with a knife. He sexually assaulted her, and then after several hours of this back and forth between beating her up and sexually assaulting her, he finally did the same thing he had done before. He set her closet on fire and then left. Now, it took 3 full hours to put out the fire. Dr. John McKay was the medical examiner. He said, quote, if anybody's interested in prize fighting, you see people punching each other in the face all the time and you don't see fractures like this. Donna choked on vomit before her bedroom was set on fire. Linda likely died from smoke inhalation. One way or another, been kicked about, fallen down, shaked, and grabbed. End quote. Now, the town actually canceled trick or treating that year, that Halloween, and they issued a warning that anyone wearing a mask on that night would be stopped and questioned. Now, meanwhile, it turns out that Alan was still in the area. He was hiding out in these makeshift camps in the woods. DNA later came back to match the crime scenes to Alan. And on November 17th, the police gave a press conference that Allan Legere had been the one linked to all of the recent crimes. And by November 15th, it's starting to be winter, like it's getting cold out. And Reverend James Smith worked at the local church in Chatham Head, but he lived in Lower Newcastle, kind of in a rural area outside of town. And he'd been the priest at the church for about 19 years. He came from a very large family. He had 9 brothers and sisters, but he lived alone in this the rectory, the part of the church that was for his living space. And on the sort of early evening-ish of November 15th, he caught a man trying to break into the house part with using a ladder against the house, and so he caught him doing that, and the man attacked him. He wanted him to open the safe up. He was stabbed, kicked, all of his ribs were broken. Alan then went around the whole house, just destroying the whole place. He was looking for something to open the safe with. He was trying, like, everything from chainsaws to, like, hammers. Finally, by the next morning, he gave up. He washed his boots in the sink, leaving some blood behind. He stepped on a magazine and left, like, a bloody footprint on it, and then stole Reverend James Smith's car and left the area in it. So then that night, so this was the next day, around 6:45 or so, parishioners start showing up for church service, and of course the place is locked and everything's quiet. So one of the men went back, I guess he had a key. So he went back to check the rectory where the reverend lived. So he used this key to open the door. The door was locked. The kitchen light didn't work, but he was still able to see, like, the place was an absolute mess everywhere, and there was a ton of blood. So he hightailed it out of there and called the police. And when they came, they found he himself was a absolute bloody mess. His left hand was twisted backwards. He had one shoe off, and of course, he had no pulse. So at this by this point, Crime Stoppers is offering $50,000 for catching Allan Legere. And on November 23rd, this is in St. John's, he was picked up by a cab driver who he wanted to go to Moncton, and so the cab driver told him, "Well, that's about $100." But Alan pulled out a gun on him and said, like, he's gonna go no matter what. Told him, like, "I'm the one they're looking for," threatened that he was gonna kill him if he tried to radio it in or anything like that. So they get into the car, or he gets into the car, and they start driving, and he's telling them to, like, go the speed limit even though the roads are really bad because it had been snowing, like, the roads were really bad. So the car wound up spinning out and then hitting the snowbank. So they get out of the car and he flags down another vehicle. This one, well, there was a woman driving. Um, and so because the roads were getting bad, he changed his mind and said, "Okay, I don't want to go to Moncton anymore. We're going to go to Chatham." So he pulled out a gun on this woman, and now there's three of them riding in this car. But she was a bit of a smart cookie. She said that she was starting to run out of gas. So he said, "Okay," and they pulled into this gas station in around Sussex, around that area. He took money from her to buy the gas, and he took her car keys from her, and then went inside to go pay for the gas. But she had another set of keys on her, so her and the cab driver took off to this RCMP detachment that was fortunately nearby. So then when he comes out and he sees, oh, the car took off on him, he takes this guy, Ryan Golding, as hostage. He was just living his life. He was cleaning the windshield of he drove one of those big, like a big Mack truck. And so he takes him hostage and makes him drive, like, all through the whole night towards the Moncton area. And he's trying to, like, go fast, but he's in this Mack truck. The roads are terrible. And then just south of Newcastle, he told him to turn left onto Highway 118, and that's the highway that runs along the Miramichi. But there was this other truck driver along behind him that saw that him turn onto this highway and realized that that's not a road that he should be going down, because he was actually carrying a pretty heavy load, and knew that based on the weather and that this was kind of a side road, he wasn't allowed to be going down there. So he thought that this was suspicious. So he called in the police, and fortunately, they were able to track down the vehicle, or the big truck, stopped him, and he was captured again on November 24th of 1989. Now, during the time that he had been out and about and living his life, they had actually taken his TV from his cell that he was in the prison, and they found that he had stored inside of it a bunch of bits of metal that he had fashioned into various types of handcuff keys. He decided to plead not guilty to escaping custody, which of course forced this very expensive trial, wasted a bunch of people's time. He again testified on his own behalf. He was again found guilty. So he had an additional 9 years added on to his life sentence, or to the parole and eligibility period, basically. And then he was charged about a year later with 4 counts of first degree murder. Had to wait for the DNA tests to come back. Now, the defense, in their infinite wisdom, decided to claim that the reason the DNA had come back as a match to Allan was that there was actually quite a bit of inbreeding in the Miramichi, which I do not believe is true. I don't believe that part is true, but that was his, and that's why the DNA matched, is because there was all this inbreeding going on. Allan himself had a number of outbursts during his trial. He actually got kicked out of court. He had to watch most of it on CCTV cameras from back inside the prison. They called 240 witnesses. He wound up with another 4 guilty verdicts. Of course, another 4 life sentences added. He planned to appeal all of them, of course. He was also caught planning another escape attempt. So he wound up being moved to the Quebec Supermax prison. He filed a lawsuit while he was in protective custody. He was in protective custody because, well, for 2 reasons. For the fighting, for one, and for he was an escape risk. And in 1994, he was actually stabbed 7 times, and he sued the Corrections Canada as well for that one because they didn't prevent the stabbing. Todd Matchett was paroled. He was 37 at the time. Now, he did apologize to the Glendinning family. And then in 2009, Scott Curtis was paroled as well. Now, he actually died in 2019. He was only 52. Allan was housed in Quebec at that Supermax prison until 2015, and then he was moved to the max security that was out in Edmonton. He has been rejected every single time he's come up for parole. In 2021, he was still blaming everybody else for the murders. He denied he's never killed anybody, he says. Um, he also appealed his parole denials, but they had said at his last parole hearing, which was the last one I could find an update for, was in 2021, quote, "Your risk is not manageable. The victim harm is still felt to this day, and you have a number of outstanding issues. According to file information, you have a history of attempting to and being successful in escaping from custody. In 1987, you attempted to escape twice. In 1989, you did escape, and in 1991, you attempted once again to escape." Now, with the 1991 escape, which apparently was held under a lot of, like it was held back from the media, he had actually planned to take one of the corrections officers hostage as well. To his point, Allen says, quote, "Why they," referring to the Miramichi community, "can't forgive me, why they can't forget, especially because he's become a different man." He says he does not consider himself a violent person at all, but the biggest reason he's been denied parole is because he continues to not take any responsibility for his crimes, which is maybe a good thing that he doesn't, because then he won't get out. Now, apparently, John Carpenter, who's the movie director, he did The Thing, and I think he does a lot of horror movies. He has a TV series out. It started in 2023. Apparently, it's called Suburban Screams. You can find it on Peacock. And in episode 2, it's supposed to be based on Allan Legere. It's called A Killer Comes Home. Now, it did only get 18% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is a little bit odd for John Carpenter. I usually like his stuff, but maybe his stuff doesn't translate to television as well as it does in the movies. Anyways, you can check that out if you have access to Peacock. Now, the reason I did this story, because I actually didn't know anything about Allan Legere. When I was researching some of the people that Dustin, who, if you don't know, he's the guy that killed my niece and his parents, was being held in Edmonton Max. I wanted to know some of the other people that he was in there with, and Alan Legere's name came up, and so I started looking into him. Now, apparently, last I've heard, Dustin is actually no longer in the Edmonton Max. He's been moved to Abbotsford, which is out in BC, which I think is a medium security. But that's the last we've heard. My sister gets updates, so she'll let me know if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's where he is. But that's why I did this story in the first place, was just because his name had come up and I'd never heard of him. And but I'm going to be back again next week with another case. In the meantime, rates, reviews, subscribe, all the stuff that you can do for me. I don't know if I know I haven't mentioned this on YouTube, but if you are interested in other podcasts, I did a collaborative podcast. It's called You Should Be Here. All the proceeds go to charity to support victims of domestic violence. Season 2 is the one that, I did 2 episodes for. It is called Or No. There'll be 4 seasons to it every year. You'll find other podcasts in there, some really great ones. Everybody has a different style, and again, all the proceeds go to, charity. So if you are interested, please go check them out, subscribe to it, follow it, and I will see you again next week. Thank you so much for listening and for watching.